Hello, everybody. Hope y'all are doing well post the spring break, I believe. I hope it was relaxing. I hope you're well rested and ready to get into this topic. Today, we're going to get into an interesting topic day today. But I want to remind you as well that we do have that paper due by this coming Sunday, and I've actually sectioned off our class recording for Thursday the 13th. This coming Thursday is actually an asynchronous day. You can pause and take that time. There's no recording of you. Really work on your paper. If you want to meet one-on-one, collaborate at all during that time, that would be a great time to do it. So you have that extra space this week to work on that. But today, we're getting into physician-patient interactions. We're going to talk a bit about race and culture and gender and these important dynamics here with physician-patient interactions. And then as well as we're going to talk about medical education and physician training, some history behind there, some interesting concepts, and then kind of the influence of a capitalist system on that. So there's going to be some interesting topics. And what I want you to be able to look at is those complex dynamics of those physician-patient interactions. And again, like I mentioned, focusing on race, culture, and gender, how those impact and influence these types of encounters. And we're also going to delve into that evolution of medical education. We're going to look at historical context. We're going to incorporate all these things into the conversation as the readings did. I really want you to be able to analyze all of these things critically, analyze the role of race, culture, and gender on physician-patient interactions. I want you to be able to think about the historical evolution of medical education and ingrain that, including barriers to diversity in that process. We're going to explore how the capitalist motives have influenced the structure and outcomes of physician training. And then I really want you to engage in contemporary challenges, think about those contemporary challenges and efforts to improve communication and empathy in our medical practices, especially in Western culture in the United States. So let's start with physician-patient interactions. Let's talk about these key impacts here. So this really comes from the Barkin reading, I believe chapter 7. So Barkin is discussing the disparities in physician-patient interactions, and specifically those that are influenced by race and gender and cultural dynamics. And so this section of the book, of the textbook, explores how things like implicit bias and structural racism lead to unequal treatment and even communication breakdowns in clinical settings. So there's a couple of key takeaways here from the reading. Number one is disparities in communication styles and perceived empathy. So research shows that physicians may communicate differently with patients based upon their race and their cultural background or their gender. And this often leads to a lack of perceived empathy between empathy from the healthcare provider. Patients from these marginalized groups might feel that their concerns are not taken seriously in a healthcare setting or by their doctor, affecting their healthcare experience and treatment adherence, of how well they're actually going to believe, buy in, and adhere to that treatment that they're prescribed. To the cultural and gender norms component as well. So culture and gender norms can affect how patients make diagnoses, or how physicians make diagnoses and how they perceive patient behavior. So for example, women may have their symptoms dismissed as emotional or exaggerated, while Black patients often have experienced being more likely to be undertreated for pain. So under-prescribed pain medication due to stereotypes about pain tolerance. And these biases, again, these historically rooted structural biases, can directly impact patient outcomes and overall trust in the healthcare systems. And there's also these real world impacts, number 3 here. So implicit bias and miscommunication can cause significant trust issues between patients and physicians. And this leads to poor health outcomes. Right? If you don't trust your doctor, you have a lack of trust in healthcare systems, and patients may avoid things like follow-up care or not adhere to the prescribed treatments because they feel misunderstood or disrespected. So when we talk about cultural competence and implicit bias and empathy in healthcare settings, some people maybe tend to think like, what's the difference? What's the difference of if the doctor diagnoses correctly and gives me the right treatment, What's the big deal? I don't know if you've ever seen the show House MD, where it's this curmudgeon doctor who's just a jerk, but he's a genius. And I've had conversations with friends and family about this, where it's like, would you rather have a doctor that's a really great doctor, but he's an absolute jerk, or he or she is an absolute jerk, like House MD, or would you rather have the really nice doctor, but they're not very good at their job? Well, most people will say, well, I'd rather have the jerk, but they're really smart and they're great at their job. But there is more nuance to that, because when you have that lack of cultural competence, when you don't trust due to a lack of empathy, when you don't listen and don't understand to that doctor, because there is that disconnect there, you do have these actual real world negative impacts, like lack of follow-up care, not adhering to prescribed treatments, feeling misunderstood or disrespected, actually have tangible impacts in healthcare settings. So don't be like House MD. Maybe be as smart as House MD, as I'm sure all of you are. Maybe don't be like him. So there's some additional notes here from the Barkin component as well. So let's talk about a little bit further about implicit versus explicit bias. So it's essential to differentiate between these two things. So implicit bias, thinking unconscious biases. So things you're not actually aware of, but that are ingrained in you, or that are actively playing a role, versus explicit bias are those really conscious bias. So think of conscious discriminatory actions and beliefs. So implicit biases are particularly important in medical settings because they often manifest during those interactions without the physician's even awareness, right? So patients are experiencing these things without the physician's awareness. So we can oftentimes think about the explicit biases, right? Explicit racism and discrimination, but implicit biases are very common and are incredibly important to understand, especially thinking about those real world impacts and some scenarios too. So like, think about how cultural misunderstandings can impact the doctor-patient relationship. So for instance, a Black patient might feel that their pain is being downplayed, or a female patient might be dismissed as overly emotional, even when presenting serious symptoms. As we know, just by the data, by real lived experiences, that these things do happen. So again, these implicit type of biases have these real world impacts that we need to make sure that we are mitigating, that we have training around, and we are doing something about to try to reduce. Communication and trust, again, it's incredibly important for physicians to actively listen and create an environment where patients feel that their concerns are heard, and that not just heard, but validated, right? You ever heard the difference between listening and hearing? You might hear something, but you're not really listening. So you want to make sure that patients are feeling validated, right? Not that just you're hearing them, but you're actually validating and listening to them, especially those from historically marginalized groups. It's really, really important. So I encourage you to think about how healthcare professionals can become more aware of their biases and mitigate their effects. So think about exploring strategies like cultural competence training, bias awareness workshops, and active listening tools to foster more inclusive and empathetic healthcare environment. Again, these things have real world impacts. There's a couple other supplementary readings I just wanted to mention here. There's the Liu reading, Doctor, I'm Going Blind, Why Won't You Talk to Me? This article illustrates the emotional distance that some patients feel from their physicians when that empathy piece and that active listening is lacking. And the focus remains solely on things like clinical facts without acknowledging the patient's real emotional state. That emotional empathy and competence is really key. And so the role of empathy in building trust really improves patient outcomes. That role of empathy is really critical. And so reflect on your own healthcare experiences for a second. Think about the times that maybe you have ever felt misunderstood or understood, positive and negative experiences with medical professionals. Think about the differences and the impacts of what were the reasonings behind why you felt this way versus another way. There's also the MA reading here, the Getting to Know Your Patients reading from 2019. And this specific piece emphasizes the importance of personal connections between doctors and patients. So the article suggests that taking the time to understand a patient's story can lead to more holistic care and better outcomes. And by no means am I an expert at this by any means, but I have friends who are actually doctors who talk about getting a patient's history, for example. There's new trainings around this of thinking more holistically, more personally when you're examining these things. So Fostering trust and a more meaningful physician-patient relationship can come out of this, and that can be very powerful. So think about strategies like those, like I just mentioned, right? Those active listening or patient and person-centered care, cultural competence training, how that might better communication and improve healthcare experiences for these diverse populations, and then impacting those real-world health outcome impacts. So let's talk about again, Barkin, I think it's chapter 8 reading here, talking about medical education and diversity and tracing the history and the current state of medical education. Because this is a good backup to what we just talked about. So chapter 8 of Barkin's, of our textbook here, traces the history and current state of medical education, really focusing how medical training is shaped by societal structures and economic priorities. It also discusses the ongoing issue of homogeneity in the physician workforce, which has really significant implications for healthcare delivery. So again, thinking about the ongoing issue of that medical training being just the same over and over again and being very homogenized of the same over and over. Where is the diversity in that medical training? So a couple of key points made from the Barkin reading. So one is exclusionary practices in medical training. So you're thinking about how historically medical education has been structured in ways that exclude marginalized groups, particularly women and racial minorities. And we'll get into an example reading in just a second. Practices such as limited access to medical schools for non-white students or the emphasis on standardized testing often favored individuals from more privileged backgrounds. And these exclusionary practices persist to varying degrees today as well, affecting the diversity of the physician workforce. And so when you have lack of diversity in your actual medical training, then the medical practitioners lack that sort of cultural competence and diversity awareness as well. And there's also a push for diverse medical school admissions. So in response to these disparities, there has been a slow push to increase diversity in medical school. And specifically in medical school admissions. So efforts including like affirmative action programs, diversity initiatives, and outreach to underrepresented groups. However, change has been incremental, and we're experiencing an interesting gap right now. We're experiencing, a backlash in society to DEI programs and affirmative action and all those sorts of things. So there are, again, ebbs and flows to this, but gaps in representation even after these efforts still do exist, and it's important to point that out, which has that real world impact on not just medical education, but medical healthcare delivery. So there's a connection to that healthcare delivery, right? That's really important to point out. So medical education directly impacts that quality of healthcare delivery. Obviously, these are the people being trained. So a homogenous physician workforce, so everyone just being the same in terms of education, background, appearance, culture, all that sort of stuff, can lead to misunderstandings and inequities in care, particularly when physicians lack cultural competence or personal experience with the populations they serve. So think about the NPR 2018 report, a push for diversity in medical school is slowly paying off, is what it was called. And so this reading showed, this NPR report showed that both the progress and the ongoing gaps in diversity efforts within medical schools. So again, they show that there has been progress being made, and that progress has made a real world impact, but then showing the continued gaps. So that importance, again, of increasing diversity, not only to represent society more accurately, but also to improve healthcare outcomes for diverse populations, that's really critical. And that's something that the data supports and that we know does have a significant impact on the experiences, especially for marginalized communities. So a little bit more on this continued. So really here exploring the intersection of societal structures, economic priorities, and the history of exclusionary practices in medical education. I really want to emphasize the need again, and as Barkin did, the need for diversity in the physician workforce, diversity of thought, diversity of background, diversity of culture, and its impact on healthcare equity. So talking really specifically about exclusionary practices and medical training. So number one, structural barriers. So historically, medical education systems were designed to privilege certain groups, again, thinking way back, particularly white men from more affluent backgrounds, through policies such as certain quotas or exclusion from racial and cultural exclusion from prestigious institutions and restricted access to medical-related resources. The use of standardized testing, such as the MCAT, often favored applicants with access to high-quality preparatory education, disadvantaging students from certain underprivileged backgrounds without that access to resources. There's also marginalization of women and racial and ethnic minorities here as well. So women and racial minorities were explicitly, not covertly, but explicitly excluded from medical schools until the mid-20th century. Even after formal barriers were lifted from that, informal biases still existed, such as discouragement from applying or unequal treatment during training, or again, limited access to resources based upon just the economic disparities. And historically, Black medical schools, think of like Howard University, arose to fill gaps for African-American students excluded from predominantly white institutions. And these institutions persist today. Again, historically Black colleges, you've probably heard that term before, often very impactful in the medical training space. And then 3 economic priorities. The structure of medical training has been heavily influenced by capitalism, emphasizing expensive education models that limit access to those with financial means. How expensive it is, not just go to grad school, but medical school, incredibly expensive, which can disenfranchise certain people from certain backgrounds who may be very capable in these fields. And so specializations with higher economic returns, think of neurology or oncology, those sort of specializations are prioritized over that general or community-based care today. So, which that disproportionately impacts underserved communities. Again, thinking about that specialization and the cost of it. Continuing on here a bit. So really thinking about contemporary challenges and efforts here in medical education. So there has been a push for diverse medical school admissions. And here are a couple examples. So number 1, affirmative action and diversity initiatives. So medical schools have implemented programs to recruit students from underrepresented backgrounds, such as partnerships with minority serving institutions and community outreach programs. Efforts include pipeline programs for high school and undergraduate students, financial support for application fees, and targeted mentorship initiatives. But again, we're seeing a backlash and a striking down of affirmative action programs in our country today. So this is another increased challenge. 2, incremental progress. So again, thinking to that NPR 2018 report, efforts to increase diversity in medical schools are showing results with slow but steady increases in the number of women and minority physicians. However, representation gaps still remain quite significantly. So with Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous students still vastly underrepresented relevant to their population sizes. So again, needing to continue forward, but things like the striking down of affirmative action, there is some additional challenges there. So, and then the third point there, economic disparities in medical training. So the cost of medical school remains a significant barrier. Just kind of mentioned that too, especially you think for students from low-income families, perpetuating the cycle of underrepresentation. Remember, we talked about the cyclical nature of things where this causes this, this causes this, this causes this, this causes this. So it's just a cycle. It just perpetuates. So how do you break that cycle? Things like affirmative action or more scholarships or greater access to economic resources for education. These things can help. Loan repayment programs and scholarships targeting underrepresented groups have helped. So those sorts of things have helped, but are insufficient to fully close this gap. So if you have, it's just from certain populations, the homogeneity, again, of this industry. If you don't have that diversity infused, then this cycle just persists. And yes, there has been again, like some certain progress, but that those economic disparities in medical training is really crucial to understand. So again, thinking about how do we impact community health outcomes by getting more diverse and trained medical professionals, we have to think broadly. We have to think more broadly from just healthcare delivery. We have to think of healthcare training now. So how do we get a more diverse population in there? And it's not by striking down affirmative action programs. It's by trying to infuse more economically, more loan repayment programs or economic supports to underrepresented communities. So how do we get the inclusion of medical professionals from these diverse backgrounds? And that's a really key structural question that this industry is facing, especially with modern challenges of today's United States landscape. Continued again, though. Homogeneity in the physician workforce is a key component here as an implication for healthcare delivery. So let's talk about cultural competence. So a lack of diversity in medical training, as historically has been, can lead to physicians who lack the cultural competence necessary to effectively communicate with and treat those diverse patient populations. So for example, implicit biases, like we talked about, right? Those unconscious biases may result in those things like misdiagnoses and inequitable treatment plans for minority patients and women patients. So, and really important to understand that cultural competence has a real impact, right? Patient-provider concordance. So research does show that patients often have better outcomes when their healthcare providers share their racial, cultural, or gender background. And this concordance can lead to improved communication, improved trust and empathy and adherence to treatment plans. Again, thinking about those real world impacts, when that happens, when healthcare providers share these backgrounds and have that trust and empathy connection, the adherence to treatment plans, so better treatment and better healthcare results actually do occur. So really important to understand that. And then health disparities. So a homogeneous physician workforce contributes to persistent health disparities for patients, particularly in these marginalized communities. So as it can result in underrepresentation in certain specialties like Black physicians in mental health care, there is a lack, there's an underrepresented in the specialties of healthcare. So again, how do we think about structurally how to improve these things? Is that we need to think economically and socially and structurally to improve these outcomes. It's harder to improve, you can't improve population health outcomes on just a day-to-day, on an individual patient interaction basis. You have to think broadly. You have to think, again, that sociological imagination component. Think about the individual experience and then think about root causes, upstream versus downstream effects, right? We need to understand these components. And I already mentioned this a little bit, but also wanted to highlight it here nonetheless. The NPR 2018 report, that case study. So a push for diversity in medical school is slowly paying off is what it's called. So a couple of key points from the report. So the progress highlighted here. The report discusses data that shows that medical school diversity initiatives have led to increased enrollment of women and minority students over the past few decades. But despite this progress, students from underrepresented groups still face challenges such as financial burdens and biases during admissions and training. And there's also data to highlight here as well from the report as the NPR report discusses. Women now make up nearly half of medical school graduates, but racial disparities still remain quite stark. So with Black and Hispanic students still underrepresented in medical schools and the physician workforce. So the report also notes that systemic change in medical education requires institutional commitment and policy reforms. And really connecting this to education and healthcare equity, because I think that's a crucial connection here. So really want you to understand how systemic inequities and medical training translate into inequities in healthcare delivery. So for example, a lack of diversity in medical specialties like obstetrics or gynecology has been formally statistically linked to poor outcomes for Black women, for example, during childbirth. And so increasing diversity in medical schools is not just about representation, but it's actually essential for improving healthcare outcomes and addressing population health disparities in patient care. A couple of other points to discuss as well. So number one, structural reforms needed. So think about what policies or practices could medical schools adopt to further reduce barriers for underrepresented groups. So for example, things like holistic admissions processes, reduced emphasis on standardized testing or preparatory testing, or increased scholarships for more disadvantaged students. There's also that healthcare impact of workforce diversity. So how do you think having a more diverse physician workforce improves patient care for underrepresented populations. Again, think of that population health perspective. So I really encourage you to connect these ideas to real-world healthcare disparities, things like maternal mortality rates or access to preventative care. How do we think more structurally? Think about the diversity of people in the actual medical delivery side of things. How do we think about getting more folks as medical professionals in specialties as well? Again, think structurally like that. So this reading here by Harley talks about this Flexner report. I'd be curious if any of you had heard about the Flexner report before, but the 1910 Flexner report was commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation, and it was authored by Abraham Flexner. And this was a landmark study that significantly transformed medical education in the United States because it advocated for standardized science-based curriculum, higher education standards, and the closure of many low-quality medical schools. And this led to a major shift towards a more rigorous and research-oriented approach to medical training, particularly impacting the quality of physicians and the overall healthcare landscape. However, the report has been criticized for its role in disproportionately impacting historically Black medical schools, limiting access to medical education for African Americans in the United States. So Harley's article here provides a historical overview of defunct Black medical schools and the impacts of that 1910 Flexner report, which significantly reformed medical education. So that Flexner report drastically changed medical education, especially for African-American physicians. And Flexner recommended co-education of men and women in medical schools, but believed that Black physicians should be trained to serve specifically Black communities. And so the report called on American medical schools to enact higher admission and graduation standards and to adhere strictly to the protocols of mainstream science principles in their teaching and research. While the report aimed to improve the quality of medical education, which it did, it marginalized many, many institutions that served Black communities, contributing to, again, those long-term racial disparities in medical education and physician representation. So it's a really interesting point in the history of medical education where, yes, improved the principles in teaching and research, improved the science-based curriculum, but also marginalized racial communities and racial Black physicians. So some key point from the Flexner it report's impact. So it led to the disclosure and restructuring of many Black medical schools, which were seen as maybe substandard, despite their importance, that cultural importance in training Black physicians to serve marginalized communities. And the report's standardization of medical education, while increasing the quality overall, like I mentioned, had unintended consequences that disrupted the pipeline for Black students into the medical profession. It also had long-term effects on Black physician representation. So the historical effects of the Flexner report do continue to persist today, resulting in the underrepresentation of Black physicians in the workforce. This lack of representation continues to contribute to health disparities for Black communities. So really just wanted to use this report to highlight the historical exclusion of Black physicians from those mainstream medical education and long-term effects of representation in the healthcare system. So think about how diverse training backgrounds are really essential for combating these health disparities. And just think this again, as we think about these sociological imagination, we think historically, and what are the historical components here? I just want to highlight as well the Being Mortal Jennings 2015 video. I'm not going to play an excerpt here, but make sure you watch that, and because it demonstrates the importance of empathy in that patient care training. It also connects and underscores how a doctor's ability to connect with patients on an emotional level beyond just the clinical aspects of care can improve patient satisfaction and health outcomes. Again, connecting that to then this Flexner report of historically why there is that disconnect and other reasons for that disconnect. So you can look further in the notes too about the consequences of the Flexner report. Again, the goal is to improve quality of medical education, which it did largely. but then created that substandard label and the closures of these Black medical schools. And a couple more consequences of those closures, things like pipeline disruption. So the closures of these Black medical schools drastically reduced the number of Black physicians being trained, leaving underserved communities with even fewer healthcare providers and economically disadvantaged communities as well. And then an institutional racism component here too. So the report failed to account for systemic barriers that contributed to resource disparities in Black medical schools and really perpetuated a cycle of exclusion in medical education. And finally, the healthcare inequities as well that resulted. So fewer Black physicians meant reduced access to culturally competent care for Black communities and communities of color, further entrenching these health disparities structurally. So it's a really interesting piece of history, but really important to understand in the history of medical education, especially in this country. So let's look at the long-term effects of Black physician representation here. Again, drawing on the Harley 2006 reading about the Flexner Report. So there's ongoing underrepresentation still occurring. So Black physicians still remain underrepresented in the medical workforce today in the United States, making up only about 5% of all United States physicians, despite Black individuals comprising roughly 13% of the population. So that disparity still exists. And this lack of representation perpetuates a general mistrust in the healthcare system, rooted in historical injustices, like the Tuskegee syphilis study, which we've mentioned before, and continued disparities in treatment today. And there's also those consequences for healthcare outcomes. So there's that cultural competence component. So a diverse physician workforce is really critical for understanding and addressing the unique needs of diverse patient population. And that then leads to patient trust and how Black patients are more likely to trust and adhere to treatment plans when their physician shares that empathy, shares their racial or cultural background. Not to say that you can't have a really great physician-patient interactions between people of different racial groups. That's not the point. We're just talking about largely this sort of cultural competence really does increase patient trust. And then bias reduction as well. So increasing representation in the medical workforce helps challenge implicit biases and improve equity in care delivery. All right, so there is this video segment here. This Being Mortal is what it's called. Jennings from 2015. And the film is based upon a book which highlights the importance of empathy and effective communication in patient care. Particularly, they're emphasizing during end-of-life situations. So just a couple of takeaways here from the video is that empathy training really equips physicians to connect with patients on that emotional level, improving patient satisfaction and overall health outcomes. And a lack of diversity in medical education and training can really impede that type of empathy, as physicians may struggle to relate to patients from different cultural or socioeconomic backgrounds. So again, really important to understand. And so some other current implications, right? The historical exclusion and current implications are also really prevalent in this video. So really wanted to use this the Harley article as well to highlight the systemic barriers that Black physicians have faced, right? Again, thinking about that Flexner report and how that has impacted healthcare delivery today, and how, this history really connects to diversity initiatives and the importance of expanding access to medical training for underrepresented groups, similar to what you see in that Jennings video. So continue to think about how increased diversity in medical education could improve outcomes for marginalized populations by fostering cultural competence, trust, and equitable care. And thinking about those examples in the video. So think about the role of historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, on continuing to fill gaps led by mainstream medical institutions. So just a couple of, key takeaways here as well, just as we start to wrap this up. So historical exclusion. Again, maybe repeating a little bit here, but again, I think it's important to reemphasize this. The Flexner report had far-reaching consequences that marginalized Black physicians marginalized Black physicians and disrupted healthcare access for Black communities. And that representation and equity component is key as well. So addressing these representation gaps in medical education is quite essential for combating healthcare disparities and building trust in the healthcare system. And then empathy in care. So empathy and cultural competence are critical components of effective healthcare delivery, particularly in serving diverse, marginalized, and underrepresented and underserved populations. So again, we have to think about all these things structurally to impact better population health, health-related outcomes. Really, the last thing here that I wanted to mention is physician training and capitalism, the impacts here. This is largely from the Barkin reading, chapter 8. And this section discusses how the evolution of physician training has been significantly influenced by capitalist motivations, with a large focus on profit just maximizing our profits, right? So we're making sure that as the maximization of profits are influenced and deeply embedded into our healthcare delivery systems. And you think like the rise of specialization as well, and the growing emphasis on hospital efficiency. These shifts have often led to a commodification of medical education and practice. So think about like the dual dynamic of medicalization and then the commodification of medical education and practice. So as our world and normal things getting increasingly medicalized, increasingly prescribed, that this is, oh, you're experiencing this, it's a medical issue now. That increasing medicalization, but then also the increased commodification of medicalization leads to a general commodification of our medical issues, of our general lives, right? So there's a really fascinating impact here to understand. But a couple of the key points that I wanted to make about specifically this capitalism impact here. So the commodification of medical training. So under a capitalist healthcare system like the United States, medical training has increasingly been viewed as a business rather than solely an educational or caregiving endeavor. And these revenue generating specializations like surgery or cardiology or these sorts of things are really prioritized in our systems, while primary care and more preventative medicine, which are often less lucrative in this system, receive far less attention in medical education. So medical schools and hospitals, again, driven by profit motives, tend to focus on specialties that will generate higher financial returns. And think of those specialties again: cardiology, neurology, those sorts of things. Rather than training on training well-rounded general practitioners who can address a broad spectrum of patient needs. And then there's that impact of capitalism on patient-centered care as well. So capitalist motives can lead to a focus on efficiency and profitability in healthcare settings, which may hinder the ability to deliver holistic and patient-centered care, how important and increasingly important that is. So economic incentives oftentimes discourage doctors to treat more acute conditions or focus on specialized procedures rather than taking time to engage in preventative or holistic care, which may not be as immediately profitable. And not to mention, the impacts of the pharmaceutical industry. As we know, there is a historically, to put it bluntly, corrupt relationship between medical professionals and the pharmaceutical industry, pushing certain drugs versus others with that back end element there. So again, really, really important to understand. And there's some other notes here, like the component of an economic incentive. So think about how economic pressures like insurance reimbursements and hospital profits can shape both the practice of medicine and medical training. I really encourage you to think about how these economic motives might conflict with providing that more comprehensive patient-centered care, particularly in the context of primary care or preventative services. If you're going to be a healthcare provider, whether that's mental health care or physical health care or whatever that looks like, how would you navigate this conflict when money's facing you this way? But the desire to create that more holistic and person-centered care is your purpose. How do you navigate that conflict? And then I also want to mention the focus on specialization versus holistic care again, because the consequences of a healthcare system that incentivizes high-paying specialties, thinking like, again, those specialties like surgery and dermatology and neurology, those sorts of things, over that primary or community-based care, that has significant impacts. And specializations often offer higher income potential for those getting into those fields. But this focus can contribute to shortages of general practitioners, and that affects access to essential, ongoing, and preventative care. So just be thinking about that. The incentivization of high-paying specialists. Thinking about if you're going to maybe be in this field, whatever way that looks, how that's going to look in your professions and how you might deal with those conflicts. So just a conclusion and wrap up here. Just want to wrap up some of the key themes that we covered today and that the readings and the videos covered. We looked at the impacts of race and gender and culture on physician-patient interactions. We looked at the history and current state of diversity in medical education. And we also talked about the influence of capitalist structures on medical training and patient care. So I just want to just emphasize that while structural and systemic issues do exist, meaningful change can begin with greater awareness and greater advocacy and reform in education and practice, which folks are advocating for, and maybe you all will advocate for as well. So I just encourage you all to think critically about how future physicians and policymakers can address these systemic issues to create more equitable healthcare practices and overall better population health outcomes and public health outcomes in our community. Maybe you will be those future physicians and policymakers that can address these things with this medical sociology perspective. Finally, just again, a reminder about your paper, your first paper. So due Sunday, the 16th, by the end of the day there. Please let me know of any troubles you have, any questions, any one-on-one. If you need an extension, of course, always available for that. But please let me know of any questions you have. And as always, I'm around if you want to meet. So thanks for tuning in today, and we will see you all next time.